The night was suffocating, thick with humidity and the kind of silence that only the deep forest can muster. I was out of breath, lungs burning from both the physical strain and the dread that gripped me. My footsteps pounded heavily on the damp ground, and I didn't dare look back, not even for a second. Not with what I had heard, what I had seen. Damn it, where is he? I muttered under my breath. I had been calling his name for what felt like hours, my voice cracking with desperation. Ethan, where are you? But the thick, towering trees, their twisted branches hanging like skeletal hands, offered no answers. The air was dense with the weight of the unknown, a presence that clung to me, heavy and unrelenting. I was no longer sure if the fear came from the night itself or from the darkness that had taken hold of my own mind. It started when my son Ethan and I, had taken a simple hike in the woods. He was always so curious, so full of energy, exploring everything. The forest had always been a safe place for us, a sanctuary even. Ethan loved the adventure, the thrill of discovery. But that evening, something had felt off. At first, I brushed it off, blaming the fatigue from the long day, but it had only gotten worse. We had reached the old oak tree, the one we always stopped at for a break, and that's when it happened. Ethan disappeared. One moment, he was sitting on the moss-covered rock beside me, nibbling on a granola bar, and the next, he was gone. I called out, at first with casual annoyance, thinking he was just playing around. But as minutes passed and I found no response, panic set in. He had never run off like this. I stood up, calling his name louder, more urgently now, scanning the tree line for any sign of movement. But the woods offered nothing. No rustling leaves, no faint laughter or footsteps, not even the chirp of crickets. Only the weight of an eerie, unnatural quiet. By the time I began to move through the forest, the light had already started to fade. The shadows lengthened, stretching across the ground like fingers ready to pull me into their depths. I shouted for Ethan, my voice hoarse, the fear beginning to claw at my chest. Where was he? The darkness was growing, but the thought of turning back was unbearable. Something told me I needed to press on. I didn't want to acknowledge it, but the thoughts crept in like a disease. What if something had happened to him? What if he was hurt? What if I never saw him again? But then another thought followed, a darker one that whispered like a voice I couldn't ignore. What if I had failed him? What if I hadn't noticed something earlier? Something wrong. I had never really believed in the stories about the forest, about things lurking in the shadows, things that could take people, vanish them without a trace. But in that moment, standing alone in the suffocating quiet, I began to wonder if those old myths had a kernel of truth to them. Was something waiting for me? I had to shake myself out of it, but the more I pushed against the fear, the more it dug in its claws. The darkness wasn't just outside me, it was inside me too. Was I going crazy? As the minutes stretched into hours, time seemed to warp. I kept stumbling forward, not sure where I was going, my eyes scanning frantically for any hint of Ethan, any sound of his voice. It wasn't long before I felt something else, a cold draft sweeping through the trees, unnatural in its suddenness. I turned, half expecting to see him standing there, but no, there was nothing. But then I heard it, a rustle, a whisper, a sound that didn't belong to the forest. I froze, heart thundering in my chest. The voice had been faint, a quiet murmur, like a child's voice carried by the wind. Was it Ethan? Ethan! I screamed into the growing shadows. Where are you? The wind picked up, swirling around me. I felt a chill run down my spine, but I forced myself to move forward. Every instinct told me to run back to the path, to find help, to give up, but the thought of losing him forever gripped me harder. I pushed forward, my legs shaking, the darkness closing in. Then, in a small clearing ahead, I saw something. A figure. A silhouette just beyond the reach of the dim light of my flashlight. I raised the beam, but it flickered, failing to reveal the figure fully. My heart skipped a beat. Was it him? I moved closer, but something in my gut told me this was wrong. The figure didn't move. It was still, almost too still. There was something about the way the air around it felt thick, like it was being held by an unseen force. Then the light flickered again and went out. Shit. I cursed under my breath, fumbling for my backup flashlight, but by the time I had it on, the figure was gone. Nothing. I was alone again. My pulse raced. Sweat dripped down the back of my neck. I turned in a full circle, but there was no sign of movement, no sign of Ethan, just the silence. It was then that I realized something even worse than the fear of losing him. I didn't know where I was anymore. The path had disappeared, or perhaps it had never existed. There was nothing familiar around me. The trees seemed to twist and shift like they were moving when I wasn't looking. I gripped the flashlight tightly, my knuckles white. I had to find him. I couldn't fail him. Not again. But the more I searched, the more I felt like something was watching me, waiting for me to make a mistake. I wasn't sure if it was just the growing paranoia or something far darker at work. Was there something in these woods? Something ancient? And more terrifying still, what if it had already found Ethan? I stopped suddenly, my breath catching in my throat. A sound, faint but clear, a scream. It was distant but unmistakable, a child's scream. I didn't hesitate. I bolted toward the sound, pushing through the underbrush, ignoring the branches that slapped against my face, the thorns that tore at my skin. Every instinct told me to keep moving. But then, as I pushed through the dense trees, something stopped me in my tracks. I could feel it before I saw it, a presence. I didn't turn around. I couldn't. I just stood there, frozen, as if the very air was closing in around me. Then I heard it again, Ethan's voice. It wasn't the scream I had heard before. This was quieter, softer. Dad. The voice was so faint, so distant, but it was unmistakable. Ethan was close. But where? The second I heard his voice, I knew I had to find him. But as I turned and started running again, I felt something shift in the air, a feeling, a pressure that made my skin crawl. The deeper I went into the woods, the more wrong everything felt. I was no longer sure if I was chasing Ethan or if Ethan was chasing me. The deeper I ran into the forest, the more the trees seemed to press in on me, their twisted limbs reaching out like grasping hands, trying to pull me into the dark. The shadows were thick now, as if the night itself had come alive, bending and twisting into something more sinister. The sound of Ethan's voice was growing fainter, but it didn't stop me. My feet barely touched the ground, as though the earth itself was pulling me forward, urging me toward him, or maybe toward something else, something I wasn't ready to find. The air was growing colder, and the forest around me seemed to be holding its breath, every sound muffled by the oppressive darkness. The only thing I could hear now was my own heartbeat, pounding in my ears, and the sound of my breath coming in shallow gasps. It felt like I was running in circles, but I couldn't stop, couldn't slow down. Every instinct told me to keep moving, to find him, to get him out of whatever nightmare had trapped us in these woods. Then, there it was again, another scream, but this time it was different. It wasn't just a cry for help. It was filled with terror, raw and pure. It shook me to the core. My legs faltered for a split second, a moment of hesitation that almost made me stop, but I wouldn't. "Ethan," I shouted, my voice cracking as I pushed harder, my legs aching from the endless running. "Ethan, where are you? I'm coming." The scream echoed once more, but this time it wasn't far away. It was close, too close. I turned, trying to pinpoint where it was coming from, but everything looked the same. The trees, the shadows, the darkness. It was as if the forest was a living, breathing entity, shifting around me, playing tricks on my mind. I pushed through a thick thicket of branches, scraping my arms, feeling the sting of the leaves against my skin. I could feel something else now, something beyond the cold, beyond the terror. There was a presence here, something that had been waiting for me, waiting for us. I stumbled into a clearing. It was smaller than the others I had passed through, and for a moment I thought maybe it was a sign, maybe I was close. But as soon as I stepped into the open space, I felt it, the sudden chill, the weight in the air. It was wrong. There, in the center of the clearing, was a figure, a child. The outline of a small, hunched figure, almost crouching, its head down, obscured by dark hair. My heart leaped into my throat. Ethan? I took a step forward, my hands shaking as I called out again, my voice barely a whisper in the stillness of the night. Ethan? The figure didn't move. It was eerily still. I took another step, my feet crunching the dry leaves beneath me, but there was no reaction. I was close now, so close, but something in the pit of my stomach told me that it wasn't him. And then the figure lifted its head. My breath caught in my throat, my entire body freezing in place. It wasn't Ethan. The eyes that stared back at me were wide and empty, black as night. The face, pale, gaunt, with sharp features twisted in a grotesque, unnatural way. A face that should not have been in this world. I took a step back, my heart hammering in my chest. But before I could turn and run, the figure spoke. Its voice was low, gravelly, like it had been buried in the earth for years. "You're too late," it rasped, the words hanging in the air like a curse. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. My mind screamed at me to run, to get away, but my legs were frozen, my body paralyzed with fear. The figure reached out toward me, its long, bony fingers stretching into the darkness, its gaze never leaving mine. "Ethan!" I shouted, the word coming out ragged. "Where is he? What have you done with him?" The figure's lips twisted into a grin, one that didn't belong on a human face. It spoke again, its voice mocking, cold. "Ethan is not the one you need to worry about. He is already ours." A flash of movement behind me caught my eye, and I whirled around, heart racing. But when I turned, there was nothing. The clearing was empty once more, just the oppressive silence and the shadows pressing in from every direction. I didn't wait. I turned and ran again, pushing past the figure, not daring to look back. My mind was screaming at me, begging me to run, to leave this place, but my feet wouldn't stop. They moved as if they were guided by something else, something darker. I heard the voice again, but this time, it wasn't just one voice. It was a chorus, whispers in the wind, calling my name, each one growing louder, closer. "Dad, Dad, Dad." I stumbled, tripping over a root, and fell hard to the ground. My hands scraped against the dirt as I tried to catch myself, but the force of the fall knocked the breath from my lungs. I gasped, trying to get back up, but something held me down. An unseen force pressing against my chest, making it harder to breathe. "Ethan!" I screamed, but the words felt hollow, as if they were swallowed by the forest, lost in the endless night. And then, from the corner of my eye, I saw it. A flash of light. Not far ahead, a dim glow, flickering like a candle. Without thinking, I pushed myself up and stumbled toward the light, desperation driving every movement. The light grew brighter as I got closer, illuminating the trees around me in an eerie glow. But the closer I got, the more I felt like something was wrong. The light wasn't warm, wasn't comforting. It felt cold, unnatural, like it was meant to draw me in, to trap me. I reached the source of the light, an old, rotting cabin. The door was ajar, a faint light spilling from inside. I didn't know why, but I had to go inside. It was as though the cabin was calling to me. With shaking hands, I pushed the door open. The air inside was thick, musty, and I had to force myself to step over the threshold. I felt like I was stepping into another world, one where the rules of reality didn't apply. I couldn't explain it, but it was as if the forest outside had become something else entirely once I entered this place. And then I heard it. A whisper. A low, chilling voice that seemed to come from all around me, filling the room with its presence. "Welcome." I froze, the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. I knew I wasn't alone. I turned, but there was no one there. But then, I saw him. Ethan. But not the Ethan I remembered. His eyes were hollow, his skin pale and almost translucent, his body thin, like it had been drained of all life. He stood in the corner of the room, staring at me, his lips twitching as though he was trying to speak, but no sound came out. My heart stopped. What had they done to him? Before I could move, the door slammed shut behind me with a deafening bang, trapping me inside. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, and the room seemed to close in on me, its walls shifting and warping. I had walked into their trap. I wasn't the one who was going to leave. Not this time. And whatever had taken Ethan was waiting for me, too. I stood frozen in the center of the room, the door now shut tight behind me. Ethan, or what had once been Ethan, remained motionless in the corner, his hollow eyes watching me with an eerie, almost knowing look. The room seemed to shift with every breath I took, the air thick with a kind of malevolent energy that made my skin crawl. The whispers surrounded me now, coming from everywhere and nowhere. They were low at first, like a soft wind brushing against my ears, but soon they became louder, urgent, more desperate. The voices seemed to speak in unison, each one overlapping the other, creating a cacophony that rattled my very bones. "Join us!" It was his voice. Ethan's voice. But it was distorted, like an echo from deep within a cave, the words barely recognizable, as if something had taken hold of him. I could hear the strain in his voice, the pain, but also something darker, something ancient. I took a step backward, my heart hammering in my chest. The walls of the cabin seemed to pulse with life, bending inward, as if the very structure of the place was alive, breathing with me. The whispers grew louder, and suddenly I was no longer sure if they were coming from Ethan or from something else, something older, something more terrifying. "You shouldn't have come here." The voice, not Ethan's anymore, was deeper, cold, and it sent a chill down my spine. It came from everywhere, the shadows in the room warping and stretching, twisting like tendrils reaching for me. The light flickered, casting strange, contorted shapes on the walls. My eyes darted around the room, searching for any sign of escape, but there was nothing. The cabin felt like it was closing in on me, suffocating me in its darkness. The window was covered with thick layers of grime, too opaque to see through. The only source of light was the flickering candle by the door, its flame dancing in the windless air, casting long shadows on the floor. I tried to call out, but my voice was swallowed by the overwhelming presence of the room. My body felt heavy, as though the very air was pressing down on me, each breath a struggle. My mind screamed for me to leave, but my legs refused to move. The walls seemed to vibrate with a low hum, and the whispers began to intensify, growing more frantic. Suddenly, Ethan's voice broke through the noise. "Dad." It was soft, barely a whisper, but it sent a shock through my body. I turned to face him, but his form had changed. He was no longer standing in the corner. He was closer now, inches away from me, his face twisted in pain and hunger. His mouth opened, revealing sharp, jagged teeth that didn't belong to a child. His once innocent eyes were now black, wide and unblinking, as if staring into the abyss itself. I took a step back, my mind racing. What was this? What had happened to him? "You're too late," he whispered, his voice hoarse and distorted, almost unrecognizable. "They're here. They want you." I couldn't breathe. The fear was suffocating, thick in the air, closing in from all sides. "No," I gasped, trying to make sense of it. "What have they done to you, Ethan? What is this?" Ethan tilted his head, the grin on his face growing wider, more monstrous. The shadowed figure of what had taken his form stepped forward, a tall, skeletal creature with skin stretched tight over bones, its long fingers outstretched. Its presence was overwhelming, suffocating, like an ancient evil that had existed long before the forest had ever been touched by human feet. The creature spoke in a voice that resonated deep within my chest, shaking the very foundation of the cabin. "You should have never come here. This place is ours. You are ours now." I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. Panic took over completely as the creature's fingers grazed my arm, cold as ice. The skin where it touched burned, a searing pain spreading through my body. I screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the walls, lost to the darkness that now seemed to envelop me. I turned to flee, but the room twisted around me. The door was no longer where it had been. The walls seemed to bend in on themselves, the very space distorting, warping into something else. The floor was slick with something that glistened, and the air was thick with the scent of decay. "Ethan," I begged, turning back to him, but his face was now nothing more than a distorted mask of anguish. His eyes were pools of black, his body twitching, spasming as if caught between two worlds. I had to get out. I had to get out. I stumbled toward the window, my hands clawing at the glass, but the dirt and grime that had once covered it were now gone, replaced by something darker, something that made my stomach turn. The reflection staring back at me wasn't mine. It was the face of the creature, the figure standing in the corner, and then I felt it. A tug, a pull, sharp and sudden, like an invisible thread yanking me backward. My feet slid out from under me, and I was falling into the darkness, into the abyss. Everything went black. When I awoke, I was no longer in the cabin. I was in the forest again, standing at the base of the towering trees, the moon high above. The air was still, cold. My breath came in shallow gasps, my body aching, my mind reeling. I looked around, but there was no sign of the cabin, no sign of Ethan. Just the endless stretch of trees, their branches swaying gently in the night breeze. I reached out, my hand trembling, but when I touched the bark of the nearest tree, I realized something horrible. The trees were no longer the same. They had changed. The bark was dark, almost black, as if they had absorbed something sinister. My heart began to race again. I turned around, expecting to see the cabin or any trace of what had just happened, but there was nothing. The forest was empty. The whispers were gone. But then I heard it. A voice, a child's voice. "Dad." It was faint at first, like a distant echo. But as I strained my ears, I heard it again, closer this time. "Dad, please." I felt the pull again, like something was calling me, drawing me deeper into the woods. I didn't want to go. I couldn't, but the voice was Ethan's. It had to be. With a deep, trembling breath, I started to walk again, deeper into the forest, where the trees seemed to grow taller and darker with every step. The night seemed endless. And then, just when I thought I couldn't go any further, I saw something. A figure. Ethan. I rushed forward, my heart beating wildly in my chest, but as I got closer, I saw that it wasn't him at all. The figure turned, its eyes black as coal, and its mouth twisted into a grotesque smile. "You shouldn't have come back," the figure said. And in that moment, I realized the truth. It wasn't Ethan I had been searching for. It was something far worse, something that had been waiting for me to return. I had walked right into its trap. The forest had claimed us both, and there was no escape.